Bom, agora nós vamos convidar aqui ao palco o senhor P.D. Villarreal, que apresentará o tema O Litígio e a Perda de Valor da Marca. O senhor P.D. Villarreal é vice-presidente sênior de contencioso da GlaxoSmithKline.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. This is, I think, my second trip to Sao Paulo. I wish I could do this in Portuguese. I know a little Spanish, but I don't think that's going to help me very much today. I've practiced law for 28 years, I'm sorry to say, at two multinational law firms, Latham & Watkins and the firm that's now called Dentons, at four multinational companies, General Electric, Schering-Plough, Merck, and now GSK. For 10 years, I've had the honor of serving as head of global litigation, first for Schering-Plough and now for GSK. And I have litigated all kinds of cases all over the world. Pretty good track record. I learned a lot along the way. But here's one thing that I've learned for sure. Litigation is a terrible way for intelligent people to resolve disputes. I mean, it really is. It's expensive, first of all. I mean, I've been involved in cases costing $200 million just in legal expenses. I've been in cases involving billions of dollars in damages and fines, setting records in terms of fines. I've been involved in cases that have lasted more than 10 years. I mean, think about that, 10 years. You know, your CEO says, you know, we have a problem. And you say, I have a solution, and it's just going to take 10 years and $200 million, okay? I mean, you know, it's really a kind of insanity. It's totally destructive of relationships at a time when business relationships have never been more important to the continued health of multinational companies like the ones I've worked for. I suppose war is more destructive than relationships, but short of that, it's pretty destructive. I mean, I do think it has reached the point in the United States where litigation excess has become a competitive disadvantage for the U.S. I work for a company that's actually headquartered in London, and, you know, sometimes I think I spend half my time just explaining the excesses of the U.S. legal system to my British colleagues. And I think there are companies all over the world who have made decisions not to invest in the U.S., in part, I'm sure not entirely, but in part, because of the highly risky and challenging litigation environment that prevails in the U.S. But it's increasingly, I think this is not just an American disease, right? Increasingly, the kinds of cases I work on have had a global reach, involving company operations in many different countries. It's been publicly reported, for example, that the issues that we have recently confronted in China have had American and British implications, as well as implications in other countries. Increasingly, that's not the exception. Increasingly, that is the rule, given how interconnected the global economy has become and how the operations of multinationals are so interconnected. And I'm also sorry to say that more and more companies are experiencing American-style litigation. We're seeing rapid increases in litigation all over the world. Even 5 years ago, you know, 95% of GSK's litigation problems were U.S.-based. That's not true anymore. And indeed, I would say we are pretty rapidly approaching the point where more than half of our significant cases will be non-U.S. based. Now, in part, that reflects some of the success we've had in reducing our U.S. docket, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it also, I think, reflects the rise of litigation in many different parts of the world. Israel comes to mind, Poland, France, but also Brazil. One of the reasons I'm here, one of the reasons the company has supported alternative dispute resolution efforts in Brazil is that Brazil, I'm sorry to say, is developing a reputation as a litigation hotspot. We have, Brazil is one of the few countries in the GSK world, for example, that has its own dedicated litigator. And that is because there is a sufficient bolus, a sufficient level of litigation in the country to justify that. A lot of it's employment litigation. I'm sure all of you know that better than I do. There's a lot of it's employment litigation, but not all of it. And so I think from a Brazilian perspective, if I'm, you know, a senior executive at a Brazilian company, or the general counsel of a Brazilian company, that would be a cause for concern, because you certainly would not want the promise, right, the potential that the company certainly has, right, to grow and prosper and to be, you know, sidetracked by the litigation disease. I mean, it's hurt the United States. The United States has enough other things going for it that we've been sort of able to overcome it. But if I were you guys, I would be concerned about that. So so here's what I guess what I think. I'd like to sort of take it back to illustrate my point with personal experience. So I arrived at GSK in November of 2009 now, so 4.5 years. And I knew the company had legal troubles, that a lot of that was public. But I really had no idea how bad the situation was. The company, and all of this now is public record, the company was looking at potential indictment by the federal government on a whole sort of series of criminal investigations, mostly related to off-label marketing. Another investigation related to manufacturing problems in a plant in Puerto Rico. Enormous issues with litigations with generic pharmaceutical manufacturers. Three mass torts, product liability mass torts, one against a drug called Paxil, one against a very innocuous sounding product, a denture cream called Polygrip, if you can believe that. And lastly, and perhaps most significantly, product liability lawsuits against Avandia, which eventually grew into one of the largest mass torts in United States history, with upwards of 90,000 claimants all over the United States. So I was brought in with a mandate not to sort of keep things going the way they were going, because I think the CEO recognized that that was not working, that was a recipe for disaster, and that we needed to make a fundamental change. And I remember in our interview, in my interview with him rather, the CEO, where we had a conversation about what we wanted to do. Now, I'd had a long background in alternative dispute resolution. I've been a member of CPR for many years and been on the board of CPR for many years, and had already done, I think, a lot of unusual and I like to think progressive things in terms of conflict management at my previous employers, at GE and at Shearing Plow. And I said to the CEO, I said, listen, I'm love to take this job, but if you want me to succeed, we're going to have to agree that we're going to have to fundamentally alter our approach to conflict management. And to my surprise, he said, yeah, I think so too. And so we embarked on a kind of experiment to see that if we changed the way we approached conflict management, whether we couldn't make a difference in the outcome for the company of how, in the outcome of the company for how we handled litigation. And so we did. So what does that mean, changing approach? Well, it meant, for example, not reflexively and routinely, taking the obvious, most aggressive litigation position, right? It meant saying, look, we can do that, and we've done that already for years, and you have too, and here we are. We're probably going to settle this case someday, because in the United States, more than 98% of all cases eventually settle. So if we're going to settle eventually, maybe we should start talking about that now, as opposed to 5 years from now. It was surprising how positive a reaction that got. So I did a lot of discussions with different constituencies and began to work out deals. So end results, cut to the chase. I think at the end of '09, we had something like $7 billion in litigation reserves. And again, this is public record. And today, I think we have about $500 million in litigation reserves. For a company of our size, that is not that much money set aside for litigation reserves. And that's been huge, right? That goes to the company's financial flexibility, that frees up cash. Today, we have no, what I would call, major litigation in the United States at all, right? We have run-of-the-mill product liability cases. Any pharmaceutical company will always have some product liability cases. We're on trial even today on a commercial case, but it's for a company our size, it's a modest-sized commercial case. So, we have a docket, but it is a fraction of the docket that we used to have. Our outside litigation costs are a third of what they were 5 years ago. And in general, the company, I think, which for a while felt that it might be, that it might seriously be hampered by U.S. litigation problems, is free of those problems for the first time in decades. So, are people, does the CEO think that that was good, that we've succeeded? You bet he does. Now, what we've had to do, however, is, related to the very topic we're talking about today, what we've had to do is refocus the energies of the group that I lead, and what we're doing now is we're working on global litigation, right? Because as we were busy, destroying the dragons, as we called them, in the U.S., one by one, we found that, that in fact our problems outside the U.S. were growing at a much faster rate now. And so what we have is we're sort of repurposing the litigators that are based primarily in the U.S., not entirely, repurposing them from being U.S.-based litigators and turning them into truly global litigators and global dispute resolvers. So we have people, as I talk to you, we have people in Korea, we have people in Vietnam, we have people in China, we have people really in all corners of the globe now doing global resolution. And I think that's the future for multinationals, right? I mean, that is where we are all heading, just as our businesses are becoming truly global. Ultimately, our conflicts and our conflict resolution, our conflict management is going to have to take a global perspective. Someone wrote years ago, and I think it's with each passing year it becomes truer, that in the future CEOs will be judged in part by their ability to manage conflict. Kathy gave a couple of examples, Jamie Dimon. I mean, that's going to become one of your core competencies, I think, if you're going to be a successful CEO going forward. And I think the other thing I want to talk about is how we did this. Yeah, a lot of it was done, through individual contact. I got on a lot of planes and had a lot of meetings in conference rooms, went to a lot of courtrooms, talked to a lot of judges. But that's not the only thing that we did. Because if we had just done that, then all we would have done is gotten rid of some problems to make room for new problems, right? So while we were getting rid of the old problems, we also had to make sure that we were creating a new way of preventing new problems, right? So this also alludes to one of the things Kathy talked about, which is the next generation of conflict management. It can't be, right? You can't just say, well, we're going to do some mediations. Mediation's a good thing. Kathy Bryant convinced me. Maybe we'll do some arbitrations instead of litigations. That's better anyway than litigation. That's all great. Do that. But you also have to think fundamentally about the way your business is structured and create a system, right, that addresses conflicts as they arise. So that, for example, if you have a business like ours, take ours as an example, that generates a lot of product liability litigation, you have to create a system that responds to that problem, right? You can't just say, well, oh well, our business generates a lot of product liability litigation, we'll solve these, we'll get some more, at least we have a job. No, right? You have to try to address the root causes of what's causing your litigation. If you have a lot of employment litigation, We don't, actually, but one of the reasons we don't have a lot of employment litigation is we go to great efforts to identify people who we might have disputes with and reach accommodations with them before they walk out the door. So you have to create a system. In our company, because American companies anyway love acronyms, we have an acronym for our system. We call it MASTER. Maximizing savings to early resolution. And MASTER is now part of the vocabulary of the company, right? People will say, well, you really need to master that. And, we have graphs, right? It's like a dashboard that every quarter we produce to the company that says, here's the number of cases we have, here's the number of cases we resolved, here's where our litigation reserves stand, here's how much money we've spent this year, this quarter, in legal expenses. It's like a dashboard in your car that tells you all of the vital information about the running of your operation. And we have something called early case assessment. So as the moment we identify a conflict, actual or potential, and I don't mean lawsuits, that's much too late. Whenever someone tells us that there's been that there's a dispute brewing with a vendor, for example, or if we read, one of our scientists reads, or we read an article, a clinical study that purports to be critical or to find some safety issue with one of our drugs, we will launch an early case assessment. Right? We'll do an analysis of the threat. We'll bring in whoever we need to come up with appropriate analysis, whether it's a scientist, whether it's a finance person. And so all of our cases, all of our issues are subject to early case assessment before they even become lawsuits. Results? We haven't had a mass tort since 2009, since I arrived. Knock on wood, there's no wood up here, but you get the idea that it is possible, right, through early case assessment, to head disputes off at a very early stage. We've reached settlements and agreements, and we've made changes in the way we do things on the basis of early case assessments. But by being proactive about it, we've been able to head off a lot of litigation that I think otherwise would have arisen. And then, of course, we aggressively use alternative dispute resolution techniques when we do have disputes. I think it's very clear we're probably one of the biggest users of mediation in the entire world. I think that's fair to say. We resolve most of our disputes through mediation. As Kathy says, it's not magic. There are days when you go to a mediation and you think, well, this was a big waste of time. But almost always, whether it's that day, the next day, 2 weeks, 2 months later, you find that the mediation process was an important stepping stone in leading the parties ultimately to resolution. I once had a mediation where I went to this mediation, that was years ago, and the guy on the other side, the client on the other side, just couldn't stop cursing and yelling and screaming about how terrible we had been. And somehow I was able to stay calm, which is actually quite an accomplishment for me. And I stayed calm and listened to him, and he storms out. And that afternoon, as we're leaving, getting ready to leave, his lawyer calls, and he says he accepts the deal that you guys originally put on the table. We never had to negotiate with him. He just took the deal and he was done. So to Kathy's point, right? Sometimes it's about emotion, right? He needed to sort of vent. He needed to, have this catharsis event, and I gave him an opportunity to do that. And we ended up resolving it on very favorable terms for the company. I guess the last point I would make before I step down is, and this is the hardest thing I think for people to understand. When our group did a mission statement, we refused to put in the mission statement that our job was to win cases or even to save costs. I mean, it's a good thing to do, that's for sure, and we put it in as sort of a desired outcome, but the mission, the purpose of the organization, we decided was something else. The purpose of the organization, we decided, was to change fundamentally the way the corporate culture, change the corporate culture and the way that it manages conflict. I really personally believe, after all these years of doing this, that conflict has to be viewed as an opportunity to strengthen relationships, right? And to strengthen the company that you're working with, right? Make it better, build its reputation, build its brand, reinforce relationships with customers. So that conflict can actually be turned into a positive for a company. It's hard for people to accept that. That's probably generation 3, I think, of dispute resolution. But that's our mission, that's our purpose, really to create ultimately not just a more profitable world for the company, but a better world in general. Our CEO, almost every time he talks to us, he says, you know what? Purpose of this company is not to make money. It's not. Purpose of this company is to provide medicines for people who need them and to improve their lives. Now, if we make money in the process of doing so, great. Wall Street will love us. But the real purpose is to help people. I don't see how the mission of a company's dispute resolution group can really vary from that. It's got to reflect the fundamental mission of the company. So if your company has a mission that's separate and apart and valuable, apart from making money, your dispute resolution system, in my view, should reflect that. That's all I have today.